Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final virtual career series for the calendar year of 24-25. I'm Amy Ruig, part of the Communication Department Alumni Council, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming Steph Harris, who is another Alumni Council member and a not only undergrad of UCSB, but a graduate student from UCSB. She's going to talk to us tonight about a really exciting career in energy. And I can't wait to learn more from Steph. As I was perusing her LinkedIn profile, getting ready, I just find it fascinating the journey she's been on. And she has some fun activities and different experiences she had at UCSB too that I'm excited that we get to learn more about. So, Steph, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm really excited today to talk about communication in sustainability careers. I'm the last one of the series, which is really exciting. So let's see, we'll progress the slides. Yep. So tonight, going to be chatting a bit about how I've leveraged my communication degree as I've pursued a career within the sustainability field, and excited to dive in a little bit more what that means and what that career path has looked like so far. So have a brief agenda for this evening so far. I'm just going to talk a little bit about like my education and my early career experience. And then we're going to talk about, jumping ahead, carbon removal, which is what my current career is in and a big passion. And then kind of how I've actually put the communication degree into practice in my everyday. So here's just a brief timeline and summary of what my early career has looked like. I was an undergrad at UCSB from 2009 to 2013. Let's see, make sure we're in the right version of this. Okay. Can you guys see this? Okay.
We can. Slideshow's good.
Okay. It keeps
Oh,
moving around. Something funky is happening here.
it keeps popping ahead on you.
It does. Seems to have a mind of its own, so everyone's getting a little bit of a sneak preview of what is to come. Okay, hopefully it can settle down a bit.
So Steph, you could just use your finger instead of your mouse. My mouse sometimes does that too.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I was an undergrad at UCSB 2009 to 2013. I actually came in as a communication major solely, and I've always loved sports. They've been a big part of my life, and I came into my undergrad degree thinking that I wanted to be a sports broadcaster, and that is actually what led to one of my extracurriculars, which was about 3.5 years at the athletic department, kind of doing marketing. And then I always had a passion for the environment, and I decided to add on a double major in environmental studies. Some of the other extracurriculars I did while I was at UCSB is I was on the cheer team for 4 years. I was a peer advisor for the communication department. I was a tour guide through Gaucho Tour Association. So um, I think the theme here is I really love UCSB, and I have a lot of Gaucho pride, and most of the um, extracurriculars that I participated in, I think highlight how much I loved my 4 years of undergrad experience. So much so that I didn't want to leave Santa Barbara, and I tried to figure out how I could stay for another 2 years at least. And so I decided to pursue a master's degree at the Bren School, and I got a master's of environmental science and management. We call it a MESM degree. And the reason why, in addition to just wanting to stay in Santa Barbara, the reason why I pursued this degree was um, I felt like my undergraduate education really helped me understand like what a lot of the problems were, particularly within the environmental field, air quality, water quality, toxic waste, energy. But I didn't quite feel like I had the skill set or toolkit to actually go out into the world and be a working professional and start to tackle and solve those problems. And I was really drawn to the Bren School, which has an interdisciplinary focus on environmental problem solving. Um, and my thesis was on, it has this fancy name on the slide here, but it was really on behavioral change in energy efficiency. Essentially, what are the different things that you could do to incentivize people to change their behavior to be more energy efficient? And I thought that was a really great way to leverage part of my undergraduate communication degree and actually bring that into my graduate studies, which was more focused on kind of a hard science, but the thesis was really incorporating how do you how do you message to people and how do you influence people and understand what the low-hanging fruit is in um, kind of combating climate change, which is like, how do we just change really simple behaviors that can go a long way? And so we did a case study actually on the UCSB campus and a couple of buildings on campus to understand kind of what motivates people's behavior. And that was really fascinating and a great way to kind of blend two areas that I am really passionate about. And then I unfortunately left Santa Barbara and continued my way north. And I worked for this small private consulting company called 3 Degrees for about 8 years. And I held a lot of different roles while I was at 3 Degrees, and most of which were in environmental commodities trading. And if time permits, and it's interesting to this group, I would be happy to double click on exactly what that means and what the day-to-day looks like of an environmental commodities trader. But it was a really fascinating job, and I essentially started as an entry-level associate. And when I left in 2023, I had a director title, and so kind of leveraged a lot of different skills to identify different opportunities within the org and kind of carve out these niche roles for myself over my time at 3 Degrees, some of which was in San Francisco. And then there's a trend also in my timeline here is I keep working my way north. So I moved in 2020 from San Francisco to Portland and finished out my time at 3 Degrees in Portland. And I'm currently working at Microsoft and living in Seattle as a program manager for carbon removal procurement. And I'm going to double click on what that means specifically because it's something I'm extremely passionate about and I think it's fascinating. And I feel very, very privileged and excited to get to do this job on behalf of Microsoft. So I'll pause for questions and then happy to go into what does it mean to do carbon removal procurement at Microsoft?
Yeah, Steph, I know you and I talked ahead of time. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First of all,
Please.
I'm so impressed by how much you fit into your day when you were an undergrad and graduate student. I'm highly ambitious in my day today too, but you make me pale in comparison. I love all the things you did to have impact on the campus. You also were, as I recall, a teaching assistant. Um, and can you talk a little bit, because that was in the communications department, correct? Can you talk a little bit about that role? I know it's always intriguing for undergrads to understand how to get in that and the value it has had for you, and why you did it. Oh, in addition to everything else.
Yeah. So I had the privilege of being a teaching assistant during grad school for five of my 6 quarters. And there's a really wonderful financial benefit to that, which is tuition support. But I also thought it was a wonderful way to stay connected to the campus and the community and stay connected to kind of my undergrad experiences. I TA'd for both the Comm department and the environmental studies department. And both, for classes that I had previously taken as an undergrad, which was also really special, and classes that I really liked. I got to TA the energy and the environment class twice, which I've now pursued a career related to energy. But I also TA'd interpersonal communication and family communication. And those are things that um, am I think a lot about in my day-to-day life, many years out of that. And so I've always loved teaching and working with folks and helping them learn and understanding how people learn. I wanted to be a teacher when I was little, and so it was a really fun way to both stay connected to the community, help students engage in topics that I'm really curious and interested about and help them see like, and learning about energy can be kind of interesting if you think about it this way. So that was a fun part of that experience.
I love that. Also, can you talk a little bit more about the peer advising role? I think that's incredible that you did that as well, and curious kind of what additional skills it gave you and how it motivated you in any of the add-on for then your next steps in your development.
Yeah, it was such a fun way to again, I think there's a theme here of just like finding ways to integrate into a community. And it's such a fun way to really feel like I was part of the department and getting to interact with students and ultimately help them problem solve. One of my very first kind of bosses and mentors who worked for the communication department, he told me, and I think about this almost daily still, it's like be the solution, not the problem. And I think the folks that go kind of furthest and are able to advance in their careers are really good problem solvers. And you do not need to have a specific degree or pursue a specific career path to be good at problem solving. I think it's being, open-minded and curious and kind of like building your personal toolkit for what that looks like for you. And so it was a really good way for me to start kind of leveraging my problem solving toolkit of how can I help students navigate what it looks like to pursue this major and pursue this degree and finish it in a timeline that actually makes sense and put puzzle pieces together. I love jigsaw puzzles. And so it was just like a big jigsaw puzzle, getting to work with students and understand like this is what your schedule might look like in order for you to graduate by this date. And I, again, value people and relationships and connections, and getting to really leverage that with other students was such a special experience.
I'll let anybody, if anybody else has a question before you move on, I'll let someone else jump in. Otherwise, go for it.
Okay. Open to questions at any point. So we'll move on for now. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Hopefully it stays here. So currently, like I mentioned, I work in carbon removal procurement on behalf of Microsoft. And so I thought in order to give some background context on what my day-to-day looks like now, I figured I'd give an overview of what is carbon removal. And we call it CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And it is various processes or technologies that actively remove carbon from the atmosphere and store that carbon in some way, shape, or form for an extended period of time. So essentially, the goal is to lower the amount of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere as one method or tool for combating climate change. And my specific area of focus and kind of personal passion at Microsoft is in afforestation, reforestation. So that is restoring degraded landscapes that used to have trees and now don't. I work with a lot of projects that are restoring degraded agricultural land. So let's say like land that once was native forest, it was cut down for agriculture, and we're now restoring it back to native forest. Coastal blue carbon or mangrove restoration. So along coastlines, mangroves have a lot of ecosystem benefits for coastal landscapes and helping to combat sea level rise. And they're really prime habitat for a lot of coastal and kind of ocean species. And those mangroves can get degraded for all sorts of reasons, a lot of fuel use, et cetera, particularly in developing countries. And so restoring that back to kind of its native state. And then smallholder agroforestry. This one is something I'm particularly passionate about, which is helping farmers kind of transition from subsistence farming into kind of a more robust agricultural system that includes planting different types of tree species on farmer-owned and community-owned land. And I'll talk about kind of an example of what this looks like in a little bit. But I essentially get to allocate Microsoft dollars to planting trees around the world. It's really simple form of how I describe what I do. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the day-to-day actually looks like. But a lot of times folks ask like, well, why is Microsoft doing this? Or I didn't realize Microsoft was doing this. And so the context is in 2020, Microsoft set a carbon negative goal. And what that means is Microsoft will sequester more carbon as a company than it emits by 2030, and then every year thereafter. And so the graph on the right here essentially shows all of the different ways in which Microsoft is actually going to attempt to reduce the emissions, reduce its emissions, starting with internal emissions. And Microsoft has a ton of different sustainability initiatives aimed at energy, waste, water. How can Microsoft decarbonize both, direct emissions and then supply chain and operational emissions? And then whatever emissions cannot be reduced by 2030 because it's too expensive. The technology just doesn't exist yet as we transition to more of a clean energy economy. There's just a lot of technologies and really what we call hard to abate sectors where the technology just doesn't exist yet or doesn't exist at scale or it is not cost effective to do so. And so for those emissions that Microsoft can't actually reduce yet, that's where we have carbon removal. And so carbon removal is essentially a form of a carbon credit or a carbon offset, but it specifically comes from a carbon removal technology. So that way we can actually make a net zero claim. For every 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted, we have 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's actually sequestered. And in the case of the types of projects I work on, the sequestration is happening in the trees. You plant trees, they sequester carbon, you keep those trees standing, and the carbon actually stays stored in the trees. Again, stop me if you have questions, but I'll keep going if you don't. Okay, so this is kind of a map of what my every day tends to look like. And I wear many, many hats in this role. So one of the first hats that I wear is I'm expected to be a forester. We'll see. Okay, exciting. Okay, so as I was saying, I'm expected to be kind of a technical expert in reforestation and these project types. And what that means is project developers submit project applications to Microsoft for review. And one of my roles is to assess the quality of the project. And do we think this is actually up to the standards that Microsoft has set in this space? Part of that is also identifying what the key risks are of the project and how do we mitigate those risks. And then a lot of coordination and being a liaison between our technical advisors. We work with a lot of consultants who help us assess the project from technical perspective and the project developer themselves. One of my favorite hats that I get to play is the lawyer. I do not have a law degree, but I get to be a lawyer, and I lead commercial negotiations on the transactions that we're working on. So I get to draft term sheets and I get to negotiate agreements and coordinate with our internal lawyers and the external lawyers we work with and kind of sit in the driver's seat on those negotiations. And I never thought I would do that and be negotiating very large contracts worth lots of money. But it is actually one of my favorite things that I get to do. There's a big marketing element to this job as well, and the comms piece of it, which is Microsoft is, and I'm not just saying this because I sit on the team, but Microsoft is the biggest buyer of carbon removal in the world. And we are leading this space and trying to define what good looks like. And so a big part of what the job is sharing all the lessons learned and all the deals that we're signing. And hoping to actually build a market for and set an example for other buyers in this space who don't necessarily have the same resources that Microsoft has. So drafting press releases and working on comm strategies, and a big part is translating really technical concepts to a non-technical audience. The work that we do can get very technical and very specific very quickly. And so how do you make that information accessible to folks that don't necessarily have the same background? And then again, coordinating with the internal comms team. I'm also expected to be a policy expert because there's a lot of, we're operating these projects, or we're investing in these projects in different places around the world. And we're expected to track legislation and regulation and how that could impact these projects, and understand kind of how do we translate that into our contract. And then again, coordinating with internal policy teams and external experts. And then a huge part of what I do is program management, overseeing each phase of the procurement cycle, setting timelines and expectations for all the different parties who are involved, and coordinating with all of them to make sure they stay on track. Our deal cycles are about 12 months from start to finish, but they often take longer. So a big part of it is just making sure that we are staying on track, and the folks that need to be responsible for work are responsible for getting that done. Okay, seems to be okay. This slide I'm really, really proud of. So it is a deal that I worked on all last year in 2024, and it was announced last month. This is a deal that is going to plant over 11 million trees in Madhya Pradesh in India. It is going to sequester over 3 million tons of carbon over a 30-year period. And we are planting all sorts of native tree species on farmer and community-owned land, mangoes and avocados and teak. And so it's really going to improve the livelihood of so many farmers, while sharing carbon revenue with them, sequestering carbon, and trying to set a model for, like, here's what we think good smallholder agroforestry looks like. So this is kind of an example of the fruits of the labor, but there's 30 years of work ahead of us to make sure that the project's operating as it should. We're working with a group called Climate Impact Partners, who's our project developer on this project, and Microsoft is buying the carbon credits, or the carbon removal. And ultimately, the goal of what the Microsoft team is trying to do here is there really isn't a lot of investment flowing into nature right now. And most traditional or institutional investors are, historically haven't seen the value of investing in nature, or they've seen it as too risky, or the returns aren't sufficient enough because it's risky. And so the role that Microsoft is trying to play here is essentially underwrite these investments so that more traditional investors or other new investors kind of come play in this space and come play in nature. And we found that most investors are willing to lend against a Microsoft credit rating. And so if Microsoft is committing to a project, most investors are willing to put money into it. And these projects are expensive. I'm under confidentiality, so I can't say what this project costs, but it's a lot of money, right, to do all the coordination on the ground, to get the trees in the ground, and to maintain the project. And so Microsoft committing to this project, the vehicle that we're using is a carbon removal credit, which represents 1 ton of CO2, or carbon dioxide. That is really the role that we're trying to play. In addition to Microsoft meeting its corporate climate commitments, we're trying to do something that's much bigger than Microsoft, which is kind of show this market that doesn't really exist today, that there are so many opportunities to really invest in nature that can have so many good benefits for both people and the planet. Move on to my last slide. So talked a little about what the job is. There's so many different ways that I use communication in my day-to-day. I mentioned a bit about risk management. So a big part of what I do is assess what are the things that can go wrong, and how do we manage that or try to mitigate those things accordingly. And that's a big part of this job, is trying to understand and use my crystal ball and think about every potential fringe scenario that I think could happen and try to solve for that. Understanding the cultural context of the places that we're working as well is really, really important. So I am from California. I'm not from India. And so a big part of working on that deal was understanding, what does it actually look like to be a farmer in Madhya Pradesh, India? And what does their day-to-day look like? And what would happen, what would happen if this project didn't exist? And would that actually be better for the people involved? Or is this project going to actually help in some way? Because I think the last thing that, we want both from like my personal brand and also the Microsoft brand is that, Microsoft is going into these countries and just, essentially like profiting off of the people there, but not actually doing anything to improve the livelihood. So that's a big component of what we're trying to do and trying to address. Negotiations is huge. I get to negotiate these very large long-term contracts. The deal in India was a 30-year contract. So we're trying to predict things that are going to happen in 2052, which is really challenging. And the negotiation tactics and strategy is a lot of understanding power and influence and the interplay between the two, and what are different tactics you can use to try to get what you want. Sometimes it's as easy as just saying no, try again. Sometimes it's coming to a compromise. Sometimes it's like having really discrete tactics in your back pocket that you can leverage in a live deal negotiation. And that's one of the really fun parts of the job for me. I've already mentioned kind of technical communication, but this is a big part of what I did in my graduate experience that I think lends itself really, really well to the job now and most other jobs I'm sure I'll have in this field, which is how do you translate technical information to different stakeholders? And I think that's a big part of maybe what's missing from the entire environmental field, is there's so much goodness that's actually happening that I think a lot of people don't see or know about. And I'm often really optimistic about the state of our climate because I get to see all the amazing things that are happening behind the scenes, or actually get to be a part of it. But for folks who maybe aren't in this kind of career field, it could probably feel like a lot of doom and gloom. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to bridge this gap, in this communication gap of there's so much amazing work happening in so many facets of the sustainability field. And how do we actually translate that to a much broader audience to understand and help folks, to really help folks understand, like, these are the things that are happening at big scale, and there is big scale change that's happening. So that's maybe a plug for students that are listening or might watch this recording or tune in the future. There's a big business idea there. Marketing is another aspect that is a big part of this job, which I had mentioned, telling the story of these projects and what's actually happening, and coming up with different communication strategies and kind of comms and PR strategies specifically for the deals that we're signing. Organizational comm is a big one. And Amy, I think we'll maybe have more of like a live discussion about this, but navigating a very large dispersed company to try to get things done can be really hard. And so there's a lot of different communication strategies and tactics that go into being successful and advancing and actually getting things done within a very large organization like Microsoft. Again, I've also mentioned policy. So how are we advocating for positive projects, markets, and environmental outcomes all at the same time? And sometimes those things are at odds with each other. And so how do we prioritize what's best? A lot of interpersonal communication as well in this job, relationship management with primary and secondary stakeholders. I think we would all agree with this, but I found very, very early on that if people like you, they are more willing to help you and do things for you. So actually developing meaningful relationships within your professional life has been a big value add for me, because then I think it's going to be much easier to get people to help you and move things along when they have other maybe competing priorities, I'll say. And then, yeah, the project management piece I think is really big. And some of my favorite people that I work with have really, really great project management skills. They're really organized. They communicate very clearly. They set very, very clear expectations of what I should be doing within the context of that project. And so I try to emulate that in my day-to-day as well. That's my last slide. There was an appendix slide if we need it, but I think that was the end of what I formally put together.
Steph, I love how you bring it to life. Both, like, I can see both of your degrees in play at every element of your responsibilities, and it's fascinating to hear how you reflect on tapping into kind of both sides of the equation from what you learned in school, but also how you've added to it throughout your career. Will you talk a little bit about how you manage that? Because you had 4 different roles in 8 years, which is a really fast progression at your first company. And then you parlayed that to go to a giant company like Microsoft, who's leaning in not their necessarily their core area, right, of software development, and making this an incredible initiative within the ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what you did to manage that career journey and how you did it?
Absolutely. I think I am very fortunate, and it's also been a little bit unsettling that every job that I have had so far did not exist before I did the job. And part of that was that, 3 Degrees is a relatively small company. When I started, I think there was somewhere between 50 and 60 employees. When I left, there was over 300. So still a small company, all things considered, but a lot of growth during the time that I was there. And um, the way that I navigated that upward growth was identifying opportunities um, that I thought and business needs that I thought were not being addressed, and raising them and saying, hey, this is actually a huge opportunity and we are missing it and someone needs to do it and I could be the person to do that. And so kind of raising my hand and saying, um, you don't need to go hire for this. You already have someone, and I know the ins and outs and intricacies of this organization, and I can help you build this function. Um, that's kind of how I did a lot of like hopping. I also, when I realized that I was at any kind of juncture thus far over the last 10 years, and I realized I'm probably going to hit a ceiling, I quickly made a pivot. There was a few moments in the last decade where I realized I'm probably going to get very bored of this. I'm probably going to stop learning and I'm going to stop growing, and I'm too early in my career for that to be the case. I'm also just too curious of a person to be complacent in a job or to just be okay with things being the same thing every day. So I was quick to recognize that and pivot and want to learn and do something new to diversify my skill set. So not only have I made like vertical changes and advancements, but there was also some horizontal jumps too, from one kind of product line and business into another, which then created even more upward growth and mobility. So
But
that's
that active career management is also really consuming. Like it's hard when you're in new roles too, where you're learning and growing. So it's really impressive that have always been managing both at the same time.
yeah.
Yeah. What was it like to go from a smaller company to Microsoft?
It was overwhelming, definitely. When I started the role, I was actually a remote employee from Portland, and I had come up to Seattle a few times. I very quickly realized that again, a theme of mine is relationships and community, and most of my team is based here in Seattle. And I realized that not being in the room where decisions are happening was both a little bit soul sucking, just as like a really hardcore extrovert. That was really hard for me to accept. I had so much FOMO, and I also realized it was going to be career limiting. I was like, I need to be closer to the people making the decisions. And I want to be in the room, or at least like standing outside the room whenever possible. So that was kind of one key element for me in like navigating a
Uh,
big organization.
I don't think people realize either how much happens after the phone call hangs up. Like that's the really hard part about the remote workforce. I don't know if you agree with this, but like the conversation keeps happening. So if you aren't there, it's really challenging. So I imagine it was even, especially as someone who wants to have the context, was really hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was tough. And it was also very hard for me to feel connected and stay plugged in and to focus during meetings. It's really hard to look at a computer screen for 9 hours a day, which I do even when I'm in the office. But and I think the Microsoft team that I work on has a really great hybrid culture because we do have some folks that are remote from different parts of the country. But for me personally, my ability to focus and pay attention, like attention to detail, doing everything virtually was a big challenge, and much more satisfied being in person. And I go into the office 4 days a week, and I really enjoy it. And I think the other thing about navigating the large organization has been you really have to know who your stakeholders are and what their priorities are. When I was at 3 Degrees, it was a much smaller company. And because I started when I did, I knew everyone. And as people were hired, I was able to kind of intercept them in the hallway or be like, hey, I'm Steph. Let me understand what your job is. And I can tell you what mine is. And we can figure out how we best work together. Coming into Microsoft, it was really not clear who those people were. And I had to figure that out, and especially trying to do that remote was really tricky, and I've had a much easier time doing that. But I think the biggest thing is like, my key stakeholders and the decision makers and the people that approve my deals. It's not just for me, it's for, there's 15 other buyers on the CDR team right now, and there's a whole renewable energy procurement team, and the attention of these folks gets drawn in a lot of other places, and my deals are often not the priority. So understanding where I fit in their priority list. And again, the relationships, like if they like me and have a personal relationship with me, they're probably going to be more likely to support me. And I want to do my best to make their lives easy too. And so that's been a big part of how I've navigated. There's also been there's a lot of bureaucracy as well, and just a lot of process because things have to have a standard process. And so just acknowledging that can be not fun part of the job, but it is necessary to get things done. And so just yeah, that like any job, there's going to be things that are not as glamorous, I should say.
I want to give others a chance to jump in if someone else has a question.
Yeah, I had a question, Steph. You don't have to go back to your slide, but you summarized the 5 areas that you work in. And I was thinking, particularly with this last slide here, we have an entire course just on what you do. I mean, really, an entire course, environmental communication and management. So I'm thinking, when those 5 areas, you must have specific teams for each one of those 5 areas who themselves are extremely expert. Could you give a little overview of the teams or the units and how many people and how you manage them?
Yeah. So there's a lot happening internally and externally. Part of, and I think it seems to have calmed down a little bit. So we'll see if we can stay here. Some of this work is happening internally and some of this work happens externally. So for this kind of first bucket, a lot of that work is external and we outsource it because I do not have a forestry degree. I'm expected to know a lot about different tree species and how they grow and different ways to actually model carbon sequestration rates in a particular species in India, for example, but I'm not actually doing the work and I'm not the true technical expert. So there's a lot of consultants that we work with who have PhDs in these topics and they can really help us go deep. And so part of what I'm doing is translating like what they say into, okay, so what does that mean in practice? And where do we think things can go wrong? And how do we contract for that? Or how do we work with the project developer to actually change the design of the project to mitigate that risk? So it's really like pulling the thread of, okay, you, friend Forrester, have helped me identify what are the things that can go wrong. And then it's my job to like, I sometimes think of myself as like an investigator with the like red yarn that's pulled from like push pin to push pin. It's like, okay, if I put this here, then this goes here. And again, it's like a big puzzle. So that's kind of one area. There's teams of lawyers. I don't even know how many lawyers work at Microsoft, but thousands, I presume. We have an internal lawyer that's specifically dedicated to the carbon removal team, and his job is to help us um, navigate the contracting process. And he's representing Microsoft and understanding what are the big risks to Microsoft and how do we manage that and through our contractual obligations. We have an entire comms team, and again, there's probably thousands of folks that do different things within the communication realm at Microsoft. I know like three of them because they specifically do kind of energy comms. I actually sit within the data center team at Microsoft. And so having to coordinate with folks that are doing a lot of like data center and energy related to data centers work. But yeah, there's kind of huge and massive opportunities within that realm. And then we have an entire policy team that's tracking policy regulations that are all related to basically every business unit that Microsoft has. And Microsoft probably operates in, I actually don't know, but I'd be really curious to know what this percentage is. But Microsoft has kind of a presence in so many parts of the world. And so we need to understand how our operations could be impacted by different policy changes. So I think there's so many ways to kind of leverage the communication degree, whether that's standalone or with paired with other things. Like I'm guessing there's, folks that go on to get law, they get a communication degree and they go on to get a law degree. And, there's, I can say that the internal lawyer that I work with doesn't necessarily have like an environmental science background, but he's been able to kind of pick this up and learn the content and be like a champion and advocate for us.
Ron, what was the course you mentioned again? I didn't realize we had that course.
No, I'm saying we could have a course just based on Steph. We can have the Steph Harris course.
Got it.
Because she's
Got it. I thought you said that a course existed. I'm like, that's amazing.
No, what there should be, and it would
be really upset.
Particularly that last slide of the 9 areas, you could have 1 week for each of those areas, and Steph could say, what does she have to do and how could she apply things? And from networking and stakeholder management, I was thinking when you were describing connecting to all these groups, you must have some psychological magic to overcome stress. Because it seems to me to be extremely stressful, so much uncertainty.
It's a really stressful job. I wish I had better stress management tools. I do. I have some good stress management tools. But I think the thing that motivates me is I get to do a lot of good. And that's something that I knew very early on, I think dating back to like high school when I took the environmentals. I'm muted. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. It's like, is my computer going rogue again? I actually took environmental studies when it was offered in my high school, and I took it twice because I liked it so much and I wanted to take the AP test for it, and it wasn't offered the first time around. And so I've always had this desire to do as much good as possible and dedicate my career to that. And it's a real privilege to get to do this job and see how much good we can try to do and on as big of a scale as possible. And so that, for as stressed as I am, it's a huge motivator to wake up every day and do this job. And it's like truly a privilege to both get to do this job, but to be excited to wake up and go to work every day, because I know that is often not the case. And I would wish that for anyone who gets to experience that on a day-to-day basis. And I think the biggest part of it is just prioritization. What are the things that need to happen now? What are the things that need to happen tomorrow? And then really good communication. I work on a team of really incredible people who all have really different backgrounds and come from really different spaces. And we all work really well together because we're working towards a common goal. And when someone needs help, we all raise our hands and we all want to be there to support each other. And then communicating up on, these are my priorities, these are the things I'm going to get done, this is my timeline, as a result of that, these are the things that will fall off because I just do not have time to it or to get to it. And I would like to have a life outside of Microsoft and not work 60 or 70-hour weeks. And so there is this like really kind of direct communication that needs to happen with anyone above me, and then setting those expectations and working accordingly. So that's maybe one way that I attempt to do that.
I have a question that you may or may not be able to answer. So I am working towards my PhD in communication, and my research is all about how do you get people to act in environmentally friendly ways. So kind of bridging persuasion with environmental communication. And I went into this PhD thinking, well, of course we need this, right? We need to understand how to maximally affect people's behavior, because at the end of the day, this is a communication problem. And how do we leverage what we know about communication to make these choices in ways that are really going to be meaningful? And I would say partially just like grounding myself in reality and what organizations are actually looking for, and then also partially like the state of the world right now. I think it's challenging to convince companies that somebody who is very good at research is needed in their organization, as opposed to somebody who has like a MESM background and knows, what are the ins and outs of like life cycle assessments and carbon sequestration. And so those are not skills that I have, but this is a world that I would love to move into with my research background. And so I'm curious, just having held so many different positions and seen so many different like ins and outs of these companies, do you have any perspective on like what path there is for someone who's like tangentially in this area?
Yeah. I feel imposter syndrome very deeply on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's because I'm expected to wear so many hats, and I don't have professional degrees in any of those hats except for communication. And I think it's been like networking has been a huge part of my career journey and path. The person that hired me, or my first boss, she didn't actually make the hiring decision. My first boss at 3 Degrees also went to Bren. So she understood what my background was and the types of skills that I was bringing. And I knew nothing about renewable energy at the time. Absolutely nothing. But I think I showed a willingness and a curiosity. Like, I want to learn. I want to be here. Here's some of the other softer skills that I bring, which you can't teach me. You can teach me how to trade. I don't have a finance background, and I spent 8 years basically being like a stockbroker for environmental products. Not a finance person, do not have a CPA, and yet I did it. But I think it's like leveraging the soft skills that you have, being curious, being the problem solver. Like, if I can imagine you're in kind of informational interviews or more formal interviews, and like you're asking questions like, what's your biggest challenge? And then your wheels are turning and thinking about, okay, how would we even think about trying to solve that? And what are like different potential solutions? And like with your research background, it's like, okay, well, where would I go to try to figure out how to solve that problem? And that's the skills and like the skill set that you bring, even if you don't have maybe some of those like other technical skills. And it's like, I have made it clear, like, do not drop me into the forest and expect me to be the forester, but I will go along for the ride and ask a bunch of questions and then help translate things. So I think those are probably some ways that you could leverage the important work that you're doing and take that into a slightly different setting.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you.
Steph, I love that you've demonstrated a couple of my favorite traits in working with anyone: a deep sense of curiosity and someone who's so purpose driven. It's clear those have motivated you and have helped you move your career along. So thank you so much for sharing. We could probably keep talking to you for an hour, but I just want to be cognizant of time. So